Howdy, Immortelium here, and today I'm going to be discussing literal versus adaptive translation. I think it's fair to say that this topic can be quite sensitive to many people who like anime and manga, so I thought it might be interesting to take a look at my own thoughts on literal versus adaptive translation, some of the misconceptions about them, and what their purpose is in the first place. So the very first thing I want to clarify, I read manga in English, I speak English, I watch anime either subbed in English or dubbed in English. So the area that I'm most familiar with when it comes to the anime and manga fandom is English speakers. I do not know how people who speak and read other languages feel about literal versus adaptive translation. And if you're one of those people, I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on literal versus adaptive translation in the comments below. But next, I should probably talk about the difference between the English and Japanese language. So there's this misconception that a lot of people have when it comes to translation, that there's always one single correct translation and that all other translations are incorrect. And that isn't strictly true. English and Japanese are very, very different languages. English is part of the Indo-European language family, while Japanese is part of the Japonic language family. And given that they're from two completely different language families, as well as the fact that they're geographically completely distant from each other, and no wonder that there's a lot of words, phrases, manners of speech, etc., that are either very hard to translate or have multiple meanings and can be translated in numerous ways and still be correct. Now, having said all that, let's take a look at what literal and adaptive translation themselves actually are. So literal translation is, for the most part, translating things verbatim. Of course, there is some modification in order to make it fit grammatically within our language, but in general, it's a pretty one-to-one translation, while adaptive translation makes modifications in order to make things make more sense, in order for things to flow better, in order for us to get the same meaning as in the original language, etc. And to be fair, that can be quite a difficult concept to grasp, but I think one of the best examples that I've ever seen when it comes to explaining the differences between literal and adaptive translation actually comes from Justin Savakis. Now, if you don't know Justin Savakis, he is a co-founder of Anime News Network, has worked a lot on that website, and I do believe now does quite a bit of disc authoring for companies like Discotheque Media, etc. But in the columns that he wrote for Anime News Network, there was one column in which he decided to take a look at literal versus adaptive translation. And the example that he gave was a scene from Fushigi Yugi. Now in Fushigi Yugi, there's this scene where a group of characters are walking and it's quite tense, and the girl decides that she is going to lighten the atmosphere. And so she picks up a stick and makes a pun. And here is where we see the differences between literal and adaptive translation. So in the original Japanese, she makes a pun based off of the similarity between wonderful, which is suteki in Japanese, and stick, pronounced something like stikku in Japanese, so like suteki stikku or something similar to that. You know, it's a pun. And when translating that, if you were to do a literal translation, what she would say is, "This is a wonderful stick." And you know, it seems very random, it doesn't make any sense. And when it comes to solving that, there are several methods that the translator can pick from. They can do that literal translation where it makes absolutely no sense to the English reader, but it is a literal translation from the Japanese. You can do the same, but include an asterisk, which will explain this seemingly nonsensical action, but of course the humor will be lost. Or you can adapt the translation. In this case, maybe the translator could try to come up with some kind of stick pun in English that works, and while having changed a bit of the translation there by making a completely new stick pun, it retains the meaning of the original Japanese in a way better than the literal translation could possibly do. So I think that's an excellent example of why adaptive translation can be good. And of course, while it's easier to point out the benefits of adaptive translation when it comes to jokes, the fact is that adaptive translation can be very beneficial throughout the entire translation of a work. Now, it is worth noting that I do believe that a lot of the sensitivity that a lot of people have when it comes to adaptive translation probably comes from how a lot of anime in the past used to be censored, used to have their storylines completely changed. For instance, 4Kids is the go-to company when it comes to that. But it's something that you still kind of see every so often. For instance, when Yokai Watch and Doraemon were brought over to America for the first time, I do believe that quite a bit of changes were made to those shows. If you want to know my own thoughts on literal versus adaptive translation, personally, I think adaptive translation is better, but in, of course, a light touch. I certainly don't want any changes made to the main storyline, and I think that adaptive translation is always better when it comes to retaining the meaning of the original media. If you're going to make sweeping changes like 4Kids did, or the Doraemon and Yokai Watch releases were, then I think you have completely lost the point of adaptive translation. You've lost the intention to keep the same meaning as in the original media. But of course, just because I prefer adaptive translation in general doesn't mean that I can't see the benefits of literal translation. It's just that sometimes I think that people want a translation to be so literal that you actually lose a lot of the meaning present in the original work. So those are my thoughts on literal versus adaptive translation. I'm sure many of you are going to have a lot to say about this topic, and of course I would absolutely love to hear it. What are your thoughts on literal versus adaptive translation? Which one do you prefer? When you mention which one you prefer, why? What are the reasons that you prefer either literal translation or adaptive translation? Can you give any other good examples when it comes to either literal translation or adaptive translation working, like that Fushigi Yuki example? And of course, if you have any other information about literal translation, about adaptive translation, about translation in general, please leave it in the comments below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, I would encourage you to use my Amazon and Right Stuff affiliate links in the description below. When you purchase an anime and manga through those affiliate links, not only supporting me, not only supporting the channel, but you're also supporting the anime and manga industry. So I'd highly encourage you to purchase your anime and manga through those affiliate links. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.